All right, everybody, moving rapidly along the highway of learning. We're continuing on the Chapter 12 PowerPoint regarding the presidency. We're going to begin with slide number 43. So let's talk about other presidential powers. The president does have emergency powers. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. So in other words, the government, the federal government, again, this would have been the North, could basically arrest people for sedition, for treason, and hold them indefinitely because of that suspension. What was interesting about the suspension of habeas corpus is, per the Constitution, Article 1 gives Congress the power to suspend habeas corpus. Again, the idea of after deliberation, that Congress, in other words, that happens. In other words, the suspension of habeas corpus doesn't happen quickly. So for President Lincoln to have done that, it was an extraordinary circumstance. It was during the time of war, the Civil War, and there was a lot of Southern spies that were subverting the government and trying to cause the government to break down. So he suspended it. What he did do is he went back to Congress, submitted to Congress what he did. Congress then approved what he did. Okay, so that's an example. FDR engaged in, obviously emergency powers. A great example of that would have been the basically rounding up all of the Japanese American citizens in time of war and putting them in kind of de facto concentration camps. Truman took over the steel industry. Okay, with this coronavirus, could we see President Trump basically engaging in some form of emergency powers to stop this? Yeah, perhaps. What would be an example of that? I know he enacted an old act that I believe harkens back to the Korean War, where it empowers the federal government in times of national emergency to take over industries, to compel them to produce product connected with a national need. Again, think the Truman administration did that for the steel industry to produce war-making equipment. President Trump he hasn't done it yet. He's allowing companies to step up willingly, but he could compel companies to begin producing masks or ventilators for the virus. He could also engage in something called, some form of a national curfew, some form of martial law, where literally by order of the federal government, nobody can go out of their house for any reason after a particular time at night or something like that. So that there are, again, the Constitution provides for that in extraordinary circumstances. Are we in extraordinary circumstances right now? Yes, absolutely. In other words, this qualifies for the type of environment that the founders of the Constitution provided for when it gave the president emergency powers, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens. Again, one of the ongoing debates that happened after September 11th was, okay, we want to prevent another 9/11. We want to basically stand against terrorism, but how much of our civil liberties are we willing to give up to prevent terrorism? Again, if you've ever gone through the TSA lines, you realize your ability to get through those lines quickly has been taken away, probably forever. And their ability to stop people and frisk people and delay people and detain people have been extraordinary ever since September 11th. It was never like that before that. And then we've talked, I know, in class about the NSA and its ability to monitor phone conversations and text messages. Could some form of extraordinary presidential powers stay in place after this virus is stopped? Yeah, perhaps. Again, we're dealing with this in the state of Michigan right now. Again, as of today, Monday, the 23rd of March, when I'm recording this, where our own governor has basically enacted a stay-at-home executive order. And so one of our liberties, being able to go out freely wherever we want, has been prohibited. But again, you can see the logic of that. In an extraordinary circumstance, that's what happens. Another presidential power is executive privilege. It's an implied presidential power that allows the president to refuse to disclose information regarding confidential conversations or national security to Congress or the judiciary. Again, probably the classic example of that was during the Watergate scandal, when President Nixon basically engaged in surveillance on the Democratic Party in the Watergate Hotel. He was asked by Congress and the courts to release the transcripts and release the recordings. He said, executive privilege, the implied power of executive privilege, prevents me from doing this. It went to the courts in United States versus Nixon, and the court held, if you look at on slide number 45, that neither the doctrine of separation of powers or the generalized need for confidentiality of high-level communication without more can sustain an absolute unqualified presidential privilege. In other words, it's not absolute. There are some limitations. The court granted that there was a limited executive privilege in areas of military or diplomatic affairs, but it gave preference to the fundamental demands of due process of law and the fair administration of justice. And so basically the president had to obey the subpoena, had to submit them, and so the nation found out that he had been spying, and his famous statement, "I am not a crook," right, as he resigned, and because he most likely would have been impeached and removed from office. If you look at slide number 46, and we've talked about this before, executive orders, it's an order or directive issued by the head of the executive branch at some level of the government. Presidents have issued executive orders since 1789, so it's not like they've never been executed or issued before this century, okay? But the frequency of them has been greatly increased. Okay, there's no constitutional provision or statute that explicitly creates them. There's a vague grant of executive power in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, and it's also furthered by the declaration that the president should take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Okay, and again, you can look at slide number 47. The most famous executive order was Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863. What is very interesting about this is if you ask the average American, if they even remember this, in particular you ask the average American student in high school, what did the Emancipation Proclamation do? If you had any history background, probably the answer would be, well, Abraham Lincoln through that freed the slaves. The irony of this is he issued this, okay, in 1863 as we were at war against the South, and it didn't free one slave in the South. The slaves in the North were already freed. They weren't, not one of them was freed in the South in 1863. Okay, it was more of a political ploy to embolden the South, to embolden Southern slaves to keep fighting. But he's remembered as freeing slaves, but that didn't happen until the end of the war. Other executive orders, again, you can see that in slide number 48. President Truman issued an executive order that basically nationalized the steel industry, placing all steel mills in the country under federal control, okay? Under, again, the idea that we're at war in Korea. It was ruled by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. The court basically said that it was invalid because it attempted to make law instead of clarifying or acting on a law that Congress had already created. So in other words, the court in Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, it basically created a precedent that presidents have followed ever since then, that presidents may issue executive orders, but it's got to be in line with or connected with an already existing congressional act. Because again, separation of powers, presidents can't make law. So this idea that tying an executive order to an existing congressional pronouncement limits the power of the presidency, okay? Another very controversial one was Executive Order 9066. If you look at slide number 49, this was an executive order where FDR delegated military authority to remove any and all people, Japanese Americans in particular, and move them to a military zone because, again, the thinking was the Japanese might fight against the United States or subvert national security. Again, a very controversial case. It went to the Supreme Court in the Komatsu decision, and the Supreme Court held that the president has constitutional authority to do this in time of war. So, in theory, there's a precedent there for basically gathering certain citizens in America of a certain national descent and basically placing them some sort of military confinement. Very interesting. Controversial today, absolutely. If you look at slide number 50, You can see the presidents that issued the executive orders the most. Again, this is all from George Washington all the way through Barack Obama. What I find fascinating there, if you see the slot, so the graph, you can see how extraordinarily high these executive orders go. Basically, beginning with the progressive movement. If you look at Teddy Roosevelt, in other words, it was rare, not used very much, and then you see the graph go up, almost exponentially with Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, all the way through FDR and Harry Truman, and so on and so forth. What is interesting is with President Obama and President Bush and Clinton and Reagan, it's actually gone back down to late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s levels. Okay, but again, you can see it very connected with the stewardship connection, or the stewardship theory of the presidency. You look at the next slide there, in slide number 51, you can see presidential executive orders issued per day in office, and you can see with FDR, he almost issued an executive order per day. So again, you can check that out. You can also look in slide number 52. This is presidential attempts to basically undo a previous president's executive orders. And can presidents do that? Yes. Do they do that? Yes. And you can see President Reagan by far reversed his predecessor's executive orders. Moving on here, you can look at in slide number 53, abuses of executive power. Again, President Andrew Johnson was impeached. President Clinton was impeached because of abuses of office. President Andrew Johnson, a lot of his challenges is he was resisting a lot of the reconstruction of the South in the Civil War in the 1860s. President Clinton, with Monica Lewinsky and all of that scandal there. Okay, Nixon, in his case, he resigned, and you can see the picture on page 54, kind of his last photo as a president, trying to convey to the United States that he's an okay guy, I guess. I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of the next sections here because, again, you can review this, but you can see the various staffings of the president. If you look at slide number 56, you've got the cabinet of the president. That's the head of 15 executive departments, such as Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture. They're appointed by the president, and they're subject to Senate confirmation. Where these are important is, remember, elections have consequences. And the election of president, when you're voting for a president, you're not just voting for a president, you're also voting for the head of the Department of Defense and the head of the Department of Agriculture and head of the Department of the Interior and head of the Department of Health and Human Services. And again, all of these different cabinet members, or in this case, HHS, that's an executive, or I'm sorry, that's a bureaucratic agency. Okay, but they advise the president there, and you can kind of see that in slides number 57, 58. You can kind of see that there. I'm going to skip over a lot of this. Where the presidency has been greatly expanded, if you go to slide number 62, you can see where the executive office of the presidency has basically greatly expanded. And in 1939, the Brownlow Committee basically in Congress made a recommendation, and they said, listen, there's so much going on here with the Great Depression and trying to get the economy going again and all that the president was doing, that the president needs help, so they need to dramatically expand the office of the presidency. Okay, so if you look at slide 61, you'll see the Office of Management and Budget, you'll see the West Wing, you see the National Security Council. These are newly created sections of the executive branch. Okay, and you can see that on slide number 62, that have dramatically increased the power of the presidency. You contrast that with the vice president. In slide number 63, I like what John Adams said. He said, it's the most insignificant office that man has ever imagined. In other words, there's not a whole lot that the vice president does, or at least constitutionally. Now, of course, it's been dramatically expanded in the modern era. Okay, the Constitution assigns no executive authority to the vice president's office, so the VP's duties are basically as determined by the president. Okay, and the dramatic enlargement of the vice president's responsibilities happened in 1977 with under President Carter's administration. And so you can see the enumerated powers of the VP in slide 65. He's the presiding officer of the Senate. So if there's a tie, a 50-50 tie, he can break the tie. He announces the Electoral College votes. So again, one of the great ironies of history is that Al Gore in January 2001 announces his own defeat because he was the vice president at the time. He's first in line of succession in the case of some assassination or something to that effect. He's also the acting president if the current president is incapacitated because of an assassination attempt or surgery or something to that effect. If you look in slide 66, you'll see the line of succession to the presidency of the United States, going from the vice president, and then following that, the Speaker of the House, and then the president pro tem, and then the Secretary of State. And anyway, you can kind of check those things out. So I'm going to end here, and we'll resume with slide number 67.